The newly released tapes granting an astonishing look at the twisted mind of a serial killer. From Jack the Ripper to John Wayne Gacy, murderers who seem to choose their victims at random both terrify and fascinate us simply because they defy moral logic. It was the disappearance of an 18-year-old Alaskan girl that led police to unravel one such killer's astounding 11-year killing spree. ABC's Neil Karlinski brings us the chilling details for our series, Crime and Punishment.
I'm not a stupid person. I'm not in this for the glory. I'm not in this for media attention.
I think in his words, he said, "You got your monster."
Good afternoon and welcome to True Crime Mysteries. If you're new to the channel, hello and welcome, and if you're returning, welcome back. We're jumping back into the serial killer series with Israel Keyes. If you have not watched part 1 yet, I would highly recommend you pause this one and go watch that one first. If you could also hit the like button and comment down below, that would be much appreciated as the engagement helps the channel to grow. And of course, if you're new here, please subscribe because I make more content like this, and hit the little bell icon so you never miss an upload because I'm bad at keeping a schedule. Today, we'll be doing another serial killer deep dive, and this time we're discussing serial killer Israel Keyes part 2. Let's get into it. Who was Israel Keyes? Israel Keyes didn't have a criminal record, which was surprising. Usually, perpetrators of this magnitude had a lengthy criminal history that showed an escalation in criminal activity. Keyes barely existed on paper. Much of what we know about Keyes is from his own interrogations, his interviews with his mother, and journals recovered from his home. Keyes had all the markers of a psychopath, and he understood from a young age that he wasn't like everyone else, and had to hide his true nature to blend in with his peers.
They know they're going to tell you something that does not line up with anything I tell you because I'm two different people, basically. And the only person who knows about what I'm telling you, the kind of things I'm telling you, is me.
How long have you been two different people?
A long time. 14 years.
It was important for the FBI to learn as much as they could about Israel Keyes. Like many other serial killers, they wanted to understand the key influences in his life that led him to become such a dangerous man. Asking the question asked for decades: are serial killers born, or are they made the way they are? Keyes was born on January 7th in 1978 in Cove, Utah. He was the second of 10 children of his parents, Heidi and John Jeffrey, who went by Jeff Keyes. His parents had met as teenagers in Los Angeles, California, and were fervently anti-government. His parents were both societal misfits and could never seem to find where they belonged. They had both been raised Mormons and had deeply instilled religious beliefs. They were married when Heidi was 21 and Jeff was 22. They wanted to raise their children in nature. They moved to Utah, where they had their first child at home birth. Heidi would give birth to all of her children without any assistance from hospitals. Neither she nor her husband believed in modern medicine. They also didn't want the government to interfere with their lives, and there was too much paperwork with hospitals. Birth certificates, immunizations, social security numbers, medical records were not something Jeff wanted his family involved with. While in Utah, they were visited by government officials who had concerns about the children. They packed up and moved to Colville, Washington, where they purchased 160 acres of rural property. Israel, along with all his siblings, were homeschooled in a one-bedroom cabin. They grew up without heat, running water, or electricity for most of their childhood. Jeff worked in the area as a handyman, appliance repair technician, and also did construction. Heidi stayed home with the children. On the Colville property, Jeff was slowly constructing a permanent home for the family by himself. mainly using resources found on the land. Heidi recalled her husband's religious beliefs to be extreme. Their children were raised with no interference from the outside world, not even a radio. They also had few friends and only interacted with other children within their church. Eventually, they left their Mormon church and instead became fundamentalist Christians. Their new church, the Ark, had extreme white supremacist ideologies, which Keyes himself recognized as impacting his formative years. Though he knew from a young age, he didn't have the same religious beliefs as his parents. The Keyes children grew up in extreme poverty. Israel had physical deformities in his toes from wearing shoes that were too small for his feet for many years. They ate what was grown and hunted on the property, and their injuries were treated at home, no matter how serious. Israel was the oldest son, and when Jeff wasn't home, he was the man of the house. He often was responsible for his younger siblings, more than both of his parents. The Keyes believed their way of life made them superior to others. They didn't rely on technology, capitalism, or anyone else to help raise their family. They were proof that the old way of life worked, and they had 10 healthy children to attest to it. But it wasn't a perfect life. In winter, Heidi would take the children to her aunt's house in Palm Springs to keep them warm. In their new church, Israel was exposed to guns and took a keen interest. He became interested in learning everything he could about how they worked, which ones were banned, and how to acquire prohibited weapons. In his teens, he began breaking into homes and stealing guns. He would then resell them as a way of making money. Israel also said that occasionally he would break into a home and just move things around, then wait in the woods to watch the homeowners come home and freak out. He described this as an entertaining activity. At 14, he started to get bored with breaking into homes and escalated to torturing animals. This was also when he began to hide his sadistic behaviors, as he discovered that his friends were appalled by this behavior. His friends had told their parents, who in turn told Israel's parents, and he didn't like that. When talking about his past, Keyes stopped being forthcoming with his escalating violent behavior. When asked directly if he hurt anyone during his childhood, he deflected, indicating that he likely had sexual or physical assault victims beginning as early as childhood. When he was 15, he started the construction of his own cabin a mile away from the family's construction, and when he finished a year later, he moved into it. Israel also at this time started working on a construction company with other members of the Ark. Once Israel began living alone, separated from his family, he became obsessed with hunting. Through hunting, he honed his patience and learned to stay still for hours at a time. He also honed in on tracking and relying on all his senses to become a stealthy predator.
When I was smart, I would let them come to me. Just remote area. You go to a remote area that's not anywhere near where you live, but that other people go to as well.
He said that while he was practicing his stealth and camouflage, he would stumble upon people on these hunting trips, hikers, other hunters, or just people on their properties, and he would try to get as close as possible without them noticing. He would visualize killing and hiding their bodies. When he was as young as 13, he knew he had urges to kill. He was caught shoplifting when he was 16, and his parents searched his cabin and found a cache of stolen weapons. They forced him back into the family home, where he could be kept close. Heidi said that she could see that he was separating himself from the church and was more defiant at home. He was rebelling against Jeff and the constraints he imposed on the family. When Israel told his parents that he didn't believe in God or organized religion, Jeff exploded. He disowned Israel and kicked him out. Though Heidi didn't share the same sentiments as her husband, and she kept in contact with Israel, she loved her son no matter what he believed in. In 1996, Jeff decided to move the family to Oregon. Israel had been reluctant to join the family, but did in order to help support his mother and his siblings. In Oregon, he helped his father build houses to sell. In 1997, Jeff again picked up the family for reasons unknown and relocated them to Smyrna, Maine. There, they joined an Amish community. Jeff purchased a property in Malone, New York, and signed the deed over to Israel. Israel didn't live with the family while they lived with the Amish. He didn't believe in the Amish lifestyle and felt it was silly. He had enough with living off-grid and being dragged from one extreme religion to the next. Israel had been forced to leave behind a girlfriend back in Colville and expressed deep regret and heartbreak for leaving her. In his journals, he had mixed feelings about leaving his family, but ultimately decided he wanted to live his own life. Israel got his GED, and in 1996, at 20 years old, he enlisted in the military. What was most odd about his enlistment was that Keyes didn't have a birth certificate or social security number. Technically, he didn't exist on paper, according to the US government. He had told people he had grown up Amish as an easier way of explaining why he didn't understand sports references or pop culture, or many things that normal people experienced. Keyes himself admitted that he enjoyed his life in the military. The structure and organization were a welcome change from his chaotic childhood, and he said he was a good soldier. He was an infantryman stationed at Fort Hood in Texas. While in the Army, he began to experiment with drugs and alcohol. He would use cocaine heavily and go on weekend-long benders, but always be able to sober up in time for duty, and only a few knew the extent of his substance abuse. He admitted to blacking out several times, but had learned to control and keep his growing alcoholism in check around his family. In the Army, he had continued a long-distance relationship with his girlfriend back in Colville, but had also been dating a woman near the base in Washington. He had been engaged to the Colville girl at one point, but she could tell things had changed in their relationship. Eventually, he called off their wedding and said he had been seeing someone at the base. The woman's name was Tammy. She was 10 years older than Israel, and it started as a casual relationship until Tammy got pregnant. He was arrested and charged with a DUI by the military police and honorably discharged in 2001. When he left the Army, he settled down in Nia Bay, Washington with Tammy. Tammy and Keyes got along well. They both had traumatic childhoods and bonded over their unusual upbringing. Tammy was half Indigenous and half African American and lived on the Makah Reservation, where Keyes moved in with her. Keyes liked that Tammy didn't give him a hard time. She never questioned when he came home late or talked to other women. In Nia Bay, he would go on trips for days or weeks at a time. He was hired as a parks and recreation worker on the reservation, and when his daughter was born, he was a devoted father. He loved children, having helped raise most of his younger siblings, and he was an excellent caregiver. Tammy also had an 8-year-old son from a previous relationship, and Keyes took over as a parental figure when he moved in with Tammy. 2 weeks after his daughter's birth, Israel's father died. He left to attend the funeral in Maine and was gone for over a week. During that time, Tammy had little communication with him. There were no records of a funeral for Jeff Keyes. There was also no death certificate or any record at any funeral home or cemetery. Investigators learned that while the family had been relocating again, Jeff had gotten very ill due to an ongoing thyroid condition that had never been treated, and he died somewhere along that trip. Tammy noted that in their time together, she couldn't remember a time when Israel went into detail about his childhood experiences. They were always broad and vague. He also said that when he drank, he sometimes would say things that didn't make sense to her. Once he said he was a bad person and that she didn't know him, and he had a black heart. She brushed it off as leftover trauma from his childhood. It was also during that time that he had an upside-down cross branded on his chest and got a pentagram tattooed on the back of his neck. She felt that he was rebelling against his religious upbringing and didn't think much about it at the time. In 2003, the couple separated and they shared custody of their daughter. Israel went on to date several women until he met Kimberly while she was working as a nurse in Port Angeles. And when Keyes was 29, he moved to Anchorage with Kimberly, and he shared custody of his daughter with Tammy. In 2007, he also started his construction business in Alaska. In his relationship with Kimberly, he began taking long trips alone. He would fly into a state, rent a car, and put thousands of miles on the rental. He also started taking trips down to Tijuana, where he would get unknown medical procedures. One of those procedures was a nose job, and he also had dental work done, as can be seen in photographs. He simply wrote in his journals, medical procedure, but it was also speculated that he may have had Botox to reduce sweat and laser hair removal. Investigators noticed early on that he was extremely nervous about leaving DNA evidence behind on his victims, and it had been a point of pride that they never found any linking him to any crimes. What also shocked me was his travels to Victoria, British Columbia. He was here on April 22, 2006 for an overnight trip where he also rented a boat. There were no missing person cases during the time that Keyes was in town, but he traveled to Canada fairly often. Keyes generally traveled paying with cash when he could. He would also take the battery and SIM card out of his phones, though there were still border crossings, hotel reservations, and car rentals where he needed to give credit card information, though sometimes those bookings would be under Kimberly's card.
The FBI releases interviews and a timeline of events of confessed serial killer Israel Keyes in hopes of identifying his homicide victims. I'm Molly Halpern of the Bureau, and this is Wanted by the FBI. Investigators say Israel Keyes, who took his own life in jail, committed 11 homicides across the country between 2001 and 2012. Case agent Jolene Godin says investigators have identified 3 victims.
It's really important to us to be able to bring some type of closure to family members that are still wondering what happened to their loved ones.
Keyes also admitted to multiple kidnappings, bank robberies, home invasions, and arsons. He told investigators he buried caches of money, tools, and weapons across the country to help him commit his crimes.
Our primary concern is identifying additional homicide victims, but we're certainly also interested in identifying other crimes that he committed because it will help us put him in a particular place in the country.
Keyes told FBI agents he related the most with convicted serial killer Ted Bundy.
He didn't really have remorse, he didn't have empathy.
Visit FBI.gov for details of Keyes' travels and interviews. Report tips to 1-800-CALL-FBI.
That is where we are going to end this part. In the next one, we're going to go over his arrest, interrogation, and confessions. As always, please give this video a thumbs up if you like the content and subscribe for more if you haven't already. If you've done all that and want to support me and the channel, we have channel membership as well as Patreon to get early access, members only content, and more. We also have merch and other goodies in the description box and links to all my socials. But until then, I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.